When it comes to choosing a dividend ETF to hold long term, there's so many different choices out there for dividend ETFs that a lot of investors, especially new investors, feel overwhelmed about which ETF is the best one to hold long term. So in this video, I'm going to go over two different dividend ETFs that are great ETFs to either hold individually or to pair together to make a great dividend portfolio. I'm going to go over how these ETFs select their stocks, what stocks they hold, and how they perform over the long term, and kind of how they both perform well together as well. The first ETF I'm going to be going over is VIG, or the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF. This is the #1 most popular dividend ETF overall, based on assets under management. The investment methodology that this ETF uses is very simple. The fund seeks to track the performance of a benchmark index that measures the investment return of common stocks of companies with a record of increasing dividends over time. And specifically, the index that this ETF tracks is the U.S. Dividends Growers Index provided by the firm S&P. Now, this index is designed to measure the performance of U.S. companies that have followed a policy of consistently increasing dividends every year for at least 10 consecutive years. The index then goes to exclude the top 25 highest yielding eligible companies. So this ETF is specifically focused on dividend growth itself and long-term dividend growth, of course, with at least 10 years of consecutive growth. And then it excludes high-yielding dividend companies that may not be really growing their dividend over time. These are going to be companies like Verizon or AT&T that just have high yield and no dividend growth at all. And from that methodology, we are going to get a very diversified number of stocks in this ETF, with a total of 315 stocks in this ETF. So again, extremely diversified. If we look at this as a high-level overview, we can see how this ETF breaks down its stocks that it invests in. So what are the industries that this ETF holds primarily? The #1 industry is information technology, and then we have a few others that are pretty closely grouped overall. The second highest being financials, and we have healthcare, industrials, and consumer staples, all being in a tight range. And there are other trailing industries as well, like consumer discretionary, communication services, materials, utilities, and energy. Overall, this ETF has almost every single sector you can imagine for dividend investing, except something like REITs, which would give you an unfavorable tax liability. If we look at the top 10 holdings of this ETF, we definitely do see a broad cross-section of industries. You see everything from tech to healthcare to consumer discretionary and energy with ExxonMobil. All of these companies in the top 10 are very well known. I assume that you all have heard of at least some of them: Microsoft, Apple, Broadcom, JP Morgan Chase, United Healthcare, Visa, ExxonMobil, MasterCard, Johnson & Johnson, and Home Depot. Now, the ETF does have a bit of high weighting at the top, with about 30% or so of the weighting being in the top 10. Overall, not too bad. It is a lot more diversified when it comes to weighting than the S&P 500, which is even more focused at the top. This is a good counter to the S&P 500 if you still want technology and the growth, but you just don't want that extremely high weighting at the top. As this is a dividend ETF, let's talk a little bit about the dividend itself. This is a quarterly paying dividend ETF. You're going to be getting a dividend payment every 3 months. The current dividend yield is sitting at about 1.79%, which is somewhat low and comparable to the S&P 500, maybe a little bit higher overall. Now, this is a dividend growth ETF, so it doesn't focus on yield, so that is to be expected. We have a 5-year growth rate for the dividend of about 8.5%, which is fairly solid overall. You're going to get a nice growing dividend over time, really working for your yield on cost over time. And of course, we do see very consistent dividend growth with it growing for the past 10 years consistently. Now, I myself do enjoy this ETF very much so. The ETF is my largest single holding, sitting at about $36,000. So I'm speaking about it, and I can tell you that I definitely believe in it because this is a lot of money at stake for me, and I definitely do think it is a solid investment choice for the long term. The next ETF on this list is the very popular ETF SCHD, or the Schwab U.S. Dividend Equity ETF. This is an extremely common ETF among dividend investors who like yield and dividend growth together. This ETF has a bit of a more complex investment methodology than VIG does. This ETF is designed to track the total return of the Dow Jones U.S. Dividend 100 Index. Overall, this index is designed in a somewhat similar way to the index that tracks VIG, but there is a bit of a caveat there. So this index measures the performance of high-yielding dividend stocks in the U.S. with a record of consistently paying dividends selected for their fundamental strength relative to their peers based on financial ratios. So with VIG, you had an ETF that had a methodology of selecting stocks specifically with a history of growing their dividend and then excluding the higher yielding companies from that list. This investment methodology actually doesn't mind those high yielding dividend companies, but at the same time, they do also select a group of stocks that consistently grow their dividends itself and consistently pay their dividends. And then on top of that, it further screens those stocks based on fundamental ratios to pick the best of the group. So you're getting a combination of high yield stocks with dividend growth and then further screened for their quality. So with that investment criteria, you're getting a total number of holdings of 104. Overall, a lot less diversified than VIG, but with 104 holdings, you are still significantly diversified overall, so it doesn't impact you that much. A little bit of a high-level overview. Unlike VIG, which had a very heavy weighting in information technology, information technology is the fourth largest weighting by industry for this ETF. Not a whole lot of information technology in this ETF compared to VIG. This ETF focuses on industrials, financials, and healthcare, and they're in a pretty narrow range with each other, each about 2% within range of the other. And then we have trailing information technology, consumer staples, and energy, with the minor holdings being consumer discretionary, communication services, materials, and utilities. You're going to see a fairly diverse set of the top 10 stocks here, various industries this ETF holds. So you're going to see everything from communications to technology to defense to aerospace and defense to consumer staples and to healthcare. Many of these companies you probably have heard of too, along with the holdings of VIG, but they're not really spoken about as much compared to the top 10 holdings of VIG. Of course, how often do you hear about UPS aside from speaking about a package that you're going to receive? You probably don't hear about it too much in the news. Neither do you hear too much about Texas Instruments unless you follow the semiconductor field, or Lockheed Martin. Overall, these are going to be very large companies, but they lack a lot of the hype behind them. They are well established and have a long operating history. They're not going anywhere, so they are still great for a portfolio addition because they are going to continually be around and pay you dividends over time and possibly give your portfolio less volatility. A bit about the dividend that this ETF offers. It offers currently a dividend yield of 3.36%, which is quite a bit higher than VIG, about twice of what VIG offers. Remember, VIG focuses more so on dividend growth. This one allows for that yield component, so you're going to expect a higher dividend yield as a result. An even better dividend growth rate compared to VIG at about 12% over the past 5 years. So very solid dividend growth overall, and a great history of that dividend growth, which has a growing dividend over the past 12 years. Overall, solid dividend in regards to yield, growth, and consistency overall. This one also does pay quarterly, so you're going to be getting a dividend payment every 3 months. Just like with VIG, I also hold SCHD. It is the third largest position in my portfolio at about $17,000. Remember, if I am saying it is a good investment to hold for the long term, I am doing it myself, so I believe in it to put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. And I think that these ETFs also go great together as a combination. Now, I own 4 separate ETFs, but these ETFs would go great together alone or together in a pair for a dividend portfolio that is very well rounded. And why would this combination of dividend ETFs provide you with a well-rounded portfolio? Overall, these ETFs surprisingly have a lot less overlap than you would think for 2 dividend ETFs that kind of invest in the same types of companies with the same strategies. Remember, both kind of focus on dividend growth in some regards. But if you notice in the top 10 of VIG, which is on the left side, and the top 10 of SCHD, which is on the right side, there is not a single stock that overlaps with each other. So you have great complementing diversity when you invest in both of these ETFs together. Remember how VIG has a larger weighting of tech than SCHD, and SCHD has quite a bit more industrials than VIG. So when you get these 2 dividend ETFs together, again, you are adding quite a bit more diversification to your portfolio without too many overlapping holdings overall. There are some overlapping holdings when you go really far down on the list. I believe something like 28% of SCHD's holdings or even less overlap with VIG, but there is a lot less overlap overall, especially considering that the portion of the stocks that overlap are very minor weights. What's important is that none of these top 10 overlap with these top 10, which are the biggest portion of the individual ETFs as a whole. You're getting the great diversification benefits, the yield benefits of SCHD with that dividend growth, and also that tech benefit and overall growth with the holdings of VIG. A little bit about the hypothetical performance of this portfolio using SCHD at 50% and VIG at 50%. Going back to 2012, of course, the combination of ETFs did grow well over time, achieving a balance of about $43,000 with an initial balance of $10,000. So it 4x the investment in about 12 years. So not bad overall. Of course, it did lose out to the S&P 500, which is always expected because the S&P 500 really includes a lot of those growth companies. And if you are investing for dividends, odds are you want stability. And stability, this portfolio provided a bit better than the S&P 500. You had a much lower worst year than the S&P 500, a bit of a better max drawdown than the S&P 500, and a lower standard deviation than the S&P 500. Overall, of course, trailing is expected, but you still grew your investment well over time, and you also maintained a lot lower volatility than the S&P 500 at the same time too. So I hope this video gave you a good understanding of these 2 great long-term hold dividend ETFs, a bit about a high-level overview and why these ETFs perform so well individually or even together as well. If you did appreciate this content, leave this video a like to get the content out there, and also subscribe for future content, and I will catch you all in the next video.